Every British schoolboy growing up in the 1970s, as I did, who was paying attention in his history lessons, was taught that the Indian Mutiny was as a direct result of the introduction of a new type of rifle cartridge that upset the Indian soldiers. It's a myth. While the new cartridge played a role in the uprising, the cause of the trouble was far deeper and predated its introduction by many, many years. Under the control of the East India Company, Britain had gradually been taking control of the Indian subcontinent since the mid-1700s following the Battle of Plassey, a decisive victory of the company over a much larger force of the Nawab of Bengal and his French allies on the 23rd of June 1757 under the leadership of Robert Clive. A century later, the company was all-powerful, controlling much of the country's governance, trade and military. While some of the Indian states had been annexed by peaceful means, others, such as Mysore, had been gained as a result of war, the siege and final defeat of Seringapatam being a prime example. Further states were occupied by more devious means. In 1834, the directors of the East India Company introduced a policy referred to as the Doctrine of Lapse, whereby a ruler that died without a male heir or son could not declare an adopted child or any relative as their heir. He was required to relinquish his rights to the throne and surrender his kingdom to the East India Company. Not much more than legal theft, this policy was applied to over 30 different cities, kingdoms and states, gradually building up a simmering resentment throughout India. Further trouble was brewing within the native Indian army. Always under the command of senior European officers, the opportunities for advancement for Indian soldiers, known as sepoys, were very limited, and, although well catered for in comparison to their British counterparts, low pay and the requirement to wear an impractical European uniform in the relentless Indian heat with little prospect of elevation in the ranks did not make for a loyal soldier. Tensions had been rising for years. There had been a small-scale mutiny in the city of Vellore in 1806 over dress code and the wearing of leather. These measures offended the sensibilities of both Hindu and Muslim sepoys and went contrary to an earlier warning by a military board that sepoy uniform changes should be sensitive to their religious beliefs. And, while the revolt was quickly put down, with about 200 British casualties, lessons that could have been learnt were ignored. Increasing numbers of pious Christian officers and their wives caused concern in many native regiments, some by having Bibles translated into the local language and distributing them amongst the men. Many in the ranks saw this as a direct attack on their beliefs from their own senior officers. With all these tensions, and many others besides, all that was needed was a spark, something to unite the Indian troops against their British overlords, something to fight for, and that's where the cartridge came in. That final spark was provided by the ammunition for the new Enfield pattern 1853 rifled musket. These rifles had a tighter fit than the earlier muskets and used a paper cartridge that came pre-greased. To load the rifle, sepoys had to bite the cartridge open to release the powder. The grease used on these cartridges was rumoured to include tallow derived from beef, which would offend the Hindus, and lard derived from pork, which would be offensive to the Muslims. The situation came to a head on the 24th of April 1857. Lieutenant Colonel George Carmichael Smythe, the commanding officer of the 3rd Bengal Light Cavalry, stationed at Meerut, ordered 90 of his men to parade and perform firing drills. All except 5 of the men on parade refused to accept their cartridges. On the 9th of May, the 85 men that refused were court-martialed, and most were sentenced to 10 years' imprisonment with hard labour. There was also unrest in the city of Meerut itself, with angry protests in the bazaar and some buildings being set on fire. In the evening, Indian troops, led by the 3rd Cavalry, broke into revolt. British junior officers who attempted to quell the first outbreaks were killed by the rebels. British officers' and civilians' quarters were attacked, and 4 civilian men, 8 women and 8 children were killed. With the 85 former prisoners now released, the rebels headed for Delhi, 40 miles away. The outbreak of the mutiny at Meerut very quickly led to an explosion of similar events throughout northern India, the scale of which is far too big to detail in a short video showcasing the medal. Should you wish to read the full story in all its graphic detail, there are plenty of good books available, none better than that written by Saul David, titled simply Indian Mutiny 1857 and published by Penguin. I highly recommend it. I will, however, focus briefly on the main aspects of the story to highlight the events relative to the Indian Mutiny medal. News of the uprising spread quickly through Delhi. British officials and dependents within the city were killed, some by sepoys and others by crowds of rioters. The Emperor Bahadur Shah Zafir was at first reluctant to be part of the mutiny. He held court with the rebels and eventually accepted the sepoys' allegiance and agreed to give his support to the rebellion. The British were slow to react at first. It took time for troops stationed in Britain to make their way to India by sea, although some regiments moved overland from the recently finished Crimean War, and other regiments already on their way to China were diverted to India. Eventually, 2 columns left Meerut and Simla under the command of Major General Archibald Wilson and Sir Henry Barnard. The 2 forces combined near Karnal. Nearby they met with and defeated a rebel army, driving them back towards Delhi. The combined force, now under the sole command of Wilson and numbering about 7,000 men, lay siege to the city, containing a much larger force of about 30,000 fighting men. Wilson, nevertheless, held his troops' position until, on the 4th of September, a siege train and reinforcements arrived from the Punjab. By the 7th of September, the siege gun had battered breaches in the walls and silenced the rebels' artillery. An attempt to storm the city through the breaches and the Kashmiri Gate was launched on the 14th of September. The attackers gained a foothold within the city, but suffered heavy casualties. Wilson wanted to withdraw, but was persuaded to hold on by his junior officers. After a further week of street fighting, the British had reached the Red Fort and retaken the city. While the British and loyal Indian troops were attempting to retake Delhi from the rebels, 300 miles to the east, the city of Lucknow was in the opposite situation. When the news of the Meerut mutiny reached Lucknow, the British commissioner there, Sir Henry Lawrence, recognised the gravity of the situation and began to fortify the Residency, a group of several buildings that served as the residence for the British Resident General. With the aid of 2 sets of pensioners, one of sepoys and one of artillerymen, and some loyal Sikh and Hindu sepoys, Lawrence brought in supplies for a siege. Large numbers of British civilians made their way there from outlying districts, including the staff and students from the nearby La Martiniere College. Also present were the bulk of the British 32nd Regiment of Foot. When the siege began in June 1857, there were 3,000 men, women and children trapped within the Residency complex. They were surrounded by 8,000 mutinous sepoys and hundreds more rebelling Indian civilians. The first attack was repulsed on the 1st of July. The next day, Lawrence was fatally wounded by a shell, dying 2 days later. Colonel John Inglis of the 32nd Regiment took command of the garrison. There were several determined attempts to storm the defences during the first weeks of the siege, but the defenders, their numbers constantly reduced by military action as well as disease, were able to repulse all attempts to overwhelm them. An initial attempt under Major General Henry Havelock to relieve the garrison was made in late July, but by mid-August it had to be abandoned. In late September a second attempt was launched, this time under the command of Major General Sir James Outram, but still led by Havelock. By this time the situation within the Residency was becoming desperate. Havelock's second attempt began on the 18th of September. His force numbered 3,179 and was composed of 6 British and 1 Sikh infantry battalions. They encountered little resistance until they reached the city, and on the 23rd of September Havelock's force drove the rebels from a walled park just 4 miles south of the Residency. The force met heavy resistance trying to cross the Charbar Canal, but succeeded after 9 out of 10 men at the Forlorn Hope were killed storming the bridge, and after further heavy fighting by nightfall the force were just metres from their goal. Outram proposed to halt and contact the defenders of the Residency by tunnelling and mining through the intervening buildings, but Havelock insisted on an immediate advance, which was made through heavily defended narrow lanes. In all, the relief force lost 535 men out of 2,000, incurred mainly in this last rush. Originally, Outram had intended to evacuate the Residency, but the heavy losses suffered during the advance made it impossible to remove all the sick and wounded. Another factor which influenced Outram's decision to remain in Lucknow was the discovery of a large stock of supplies beneath the Residency, sufficient to maintain the garrison for 2 months. With the garrison reinforced by the force that was meant to rescue them, the area under siege grew bigger as the new troops occupied adjacent buildings. Likewise, the number of rebels surrounding the besieged grew to an estimated 30,000. With the fall of Delhi in September and reinforcements finally arriving from overseas, a final successful relief mission was started under Sir Colin Campbell. Having gathered his force in Cawnpore, he advanced on Lucknow in early November with 600 cavalry, 3,500 infantry and 42 guns. He also had a naval brigade formed from marines and sailors from the Shannon, Pearl and Sarsaparilla, with the ship's guns that had fought their way up from Calcutta to meet up with Campbell's force. At daybreak on the 14th of November, Campbell commenced his relief of Lucknow. Aware of the loss of life by the previous attempt at the Charbar Bridge and the fighting through the tortuous narrow streets of Lucknow, Campbell opted to make a flanking march to the east. At first the march around the city was without opposition, but as they neared the Residency, the rebels, barricaded in various gardens, mosques and palaces, put up ever-increasing resistance to the advancing British troops. By the 17th of November, the relief force was just 450 yards from success. Stubborn resistance continued as the sepoys defended their remaining positions, but repeated efforts by the British cleared these last pockets of resistance. The second relief column had reached the Residency. Although Outram and Havelock both recommended fighting on to secure the British position, Campbell knew that other rebel forces were threatening other cities held by the British, and he ordered Lucknow to be abandoned. The evacuation began on November the 19th. While Campbell's artillery bombarded rebel positions to distract them, canvas screens were erected to shield the open space from the rebels' view. The women, children, sick and wounded made their way out of the Residency under the cover of these screens, some in a variety of carriages or on litters, others on foot. The first siege had lasted 87 days, the second siege a further 61. It is estimated that the final death toll of the besieged through disease and rebel attacks was approximately 2,500 men, women and children. As the rebel defeats in Delhi and Lucknow and other cities across northern India spread, the rebel leaders were increasingly backed into a guerrilla war, with pockets of resistance constantly being flushed out and usually brutally put down, the last of which was in November 1858, 18 months after the initial uprising at Meerut. While the events in India in 1857 are usually known as the Indian Mutiny, it should be noted that it is also somewhat of a civil war. When the rebellion broke out, most of the regiments of the Army of Bengal joined the mutineers, but many men declined to do so, remaining loyal to the Crown, fighting and dying alongside their British counterparts. This was particularly the case with the Sikh and Gurkha troops, whose loyalty was crucial to the eventual British victory. It should also be said that, at the time, Indian soldiers were divided into 3 different armies, those of Bombay, Madras and Bengal. Only the Bengal army mutinied, the other 2 stayed largely neutral. Had they both joined the Bengal in the rebellion, it is most certain that the British toll would have been considerably higher and the subcontinent lost to the Empire prior to 1860. Just before the eventual end of the mutiny, it was announced by General Order 363, dated the 18th of August 1858, that there would be a medal for all those troops that had been engaged against the rebels. Such was the nature of the conflict that later, in 1868, it was further announced that the medal would be awarded to all persons that had fought or been under fire. The obverse, or front, of the Indian Mutiny Medal was designed by William Wyon. It features the crowned head of a young Queen Victoria, facing left, with the legend Victoria Regina, around the edge. The reverse was designed by Leonard Charles Wyon. It shows a standing, helmeted figure of Britannia, holding a wreath in her outstretched right hand and a Union shield on her left arm. She is standing in front of a lion. Above is the word India and the dates 1857 to 1858 in the excerpt below. The medal disc, made of fine silver, is 36 mm in diameter. It is held to its ribbon by a somewhat unusual suspender. Horn-shaped and lacking the floration of previous medals, it has a higher than normal claw, giving the whole medal a slightly elongated look. The ribbon, which is 32 mm wide, is white with 2 scarlet stripes, each stripe being of equal width. The recipient's name and regiment or ship is impressed on the rim of the medal in block Roman capitals. 5 clasps were authorised, although the maximum awarded to any one man was 4. The order of clasps reads downwards from the top of the medal. The first, for Delhi, was awarded to all troops that were employed in the recapture of the city from the rebels between the 30th of May and the 14th of September 1857. The second clasp, that for the defence of Lucknow, was awarded to the original defenders of Lucknow and to the first relief column commanded by Sir Henry Havelock, sent to relieve them. Many of the recipients of this clasp were civilians trapped in the Residency and forced to fight for their lives, including 64 staff and students from La Martiniere College. It is a sad fact that although the medal was supposed to be awarded to all those under fire in the mutiny, none of the women trapped in the Residency alongside their male counterparts received one. The third clasp was awarded to all the troops that took part in the successful relief of Lucknow in November 1857 under the command of Sir Colin Campbell. Among the recipients of this bar were the members of the Naval Brigade sent from Calcutta. The fourth clasp, and final for actions around Lucknow, was awarded to troops under the command of Sir Colin Campbell, who were engaged in the final operations leading to the surrender of Lucknow and the clearing of the surrounding areas between November 1857 and March 1858. The last clasp to be authorised was that of Central India. This clasp was awarded to all the troops who served under Major General Sir Hugh Rose, Major Generals Roberts, and Major General Whitlock between January and June 1858. They were employed throughout central India, mopping up and retaking rebel-held areas and hunting down the rebel leaders. The medal could also be issued without a clasp to those who served but were not present during any of these major operations. The majority of these awards were made as a result of the 1868 extension of eligibility. In total, some 290,000 medals were finally issued. The medal shown here was awarded to James Pawley of the 75th Regiment. James was born in 1835 at Hayley in Suffolk to James, a fruit dealer, and his wife Susanna. He had an older brother, Ambrose. The 75th were at the forefront of the action to retake the city of Delhi, with a detachment also sent to relieve Lucknow. I can only assume that James was part of the action at Delhi, as his medal bears the clasp for the battle, but something happened to him there, as the medal roll, dated December 1858, for his entitlement, clearly shows, but by then he had been invalided back to Europe. The census records for 1861 show him to be at the 3rd Depot Battalion Huts Barracks in Brompton in Kent. He was admitted into a lunacy hospital on the 25th of April 1863 and is recorded as having died, aged just 28, in September of the same year. James was buried at St Andrew's Anglican Church in Laham, Suffolk. But that's not quite the end of the story of his medal. Heartbroken by his death, someone, almost certainly his mother Susanna, arranged to have his award converted into a brooch, something she could wear in his memory, maybe every day, maybe just with her Sunday best, close to her heart to remember her youngest son. Susanna died within 10 years, as James's father is listed as being a widower in 1871. The brooch medal now kept, no doubt tucked safely away in the family home. 150 years later it came into my custodianship, and I, some would say wrongfully, have had it restored, using original parts and done by an expert in the field, now James Pawley's medal is once again, as it should be, a permanent reminder to James's service and sacrifice to his country. Join us again next time when we return to China for part 2 of the Opium Wars.